Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Patrick Rich from the Carlton Footy Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Max Gorn, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Number 49 in the 50 most relevant, a brand new Magpie and a brand new player to consider for your fantasy football sides in 2025. Harry Perryman, defensive eligible, and there is a lot to talk about this new Magpie and the 50 most relevant. Joining me on this podcast is a regular part of the Coaches Panel. You've seen him also veer into the AFL Fantasy Fanatics podcast stable, and who knows what 2025 will hold for this man in the fantasy footy community. Jordox, nice to see you. No Crows in the 50 just yet, but an interesting player to talk about nonetheless, isn't he?
Absolutely, mate. Yes, good to be on. Good to see you. Happy New Year.
You too.
Yes, no Crows so far from the whole one that you've gone through, so disappointed, but that's okay. I'm sure there'll be some coming up ahead. But yeah, Harry Perryman, he's a really good player to talk about. There's, I think there's a fair bit unknown about him, so we'll flesh that out in this chat now. But I think he's going to be, he's going to have an impact, whether it's in the AFL fantasy world or if it's just for Collingwood.
So much of what Collingwood deliver for us in 2025 is unknown. But before we get into that, let's go back in time and look a little bit at what's made Harry not just someone that's fitting into my 50 most relevant, but what he's done for us over the past couple of years. He's defensive eligible, an average last year of 74 in AFL fantasy, coming in off a 77.5 in SuperCoach. That was from 19 games. He's set just over that 400k marker in SuperCoach, while in AFL fantasy a touch over 750k. In AFL Dream Team, a little bit under that $750,000 market. Last year, his top score came in the same game it was against the other more recently established club, the Gold Coast Suns. We can't say that for long before Tassie jump in. Hey, a 104 was his top score in Dream Team and Fantasy last year against the Suns, while it was a 131 in SuperCoach. But neither of those are anywhere really super tight to what he's done from a career high perspective. He's got a 132 against the Bulldogs back in 2022 for fantasy and a 149 against that same team, the Bulldogs, in 2020. Is that a good sign considering he's got the Dogs in the first 3 rounds of this year? We'll talk about that. Jordox, you mentioned how fascinating Harry is as a player. I feel like depending on where you find yourself based kind of geologically across the country, you have this narrative and bias about basically the clubs that are in your region and or the club that you support. And if given the based on the fan size, GWS don't have a massive fan base. And so I do think a player like Harry, who's not a star, we just don't know too much about him as a player, but really he's this really smart footballer. Maybe not worth the contract he's on, but who cares? He's got it. He's a physically tough footballer. Like his ability to win contested ball, he's got it. He's happy to apply the defensive pressure. Got a decent bit of spread about him, so find some shape. And then he's a really good user of the ball. He's been a midfielder for us before, a defender for us before. It's probably the thing that he's best at, but probably the thing that's hurt him the most from a fantasy perspective is his versatility. Means he could almost play outside of key positions, almost any other position on the ground.
He's really tough too. He's always featuring highly in the tackling side of the game. And you're right, playing for the Giants and being a bit of I wouldn't say he was a fringe player at the Giants, but certainly he's been in and out, probably more due to injury than anything. I wouldn't be surprised if when his name was talked about in the trade period, if many fans, in our where we are in Victoria, thought, I know the name, I can't put a face to him, but geez, if you're going to go to a club to be known, it's Collingwood. So we're all going to know him this year, one way or another. I think what you said before is spot on, though. He just hasn't been able to find a home in terms of position, and that's because he's pretty good wherever you put him on the pack. So he's he's almost a bit of a Mr. Fix-It. So I guess what we're hoping to see in the fantasy world is Collingwood give him a more defined role that we can then make a choice on whether that's going to suit our fantasy squads or not.
Last year, just the one AFL fantasy ton that we alluded to in that Gold Coast game. And he did just creep over the line with that too, with a 104. A couple extra SuperCoach tons for us in AFL fantasy and the one in SuperCoach. Similar in 2023, only not even a handful of tons across the formats. So you might be thinking, well, hang on, MJ, here's a guy that positionally is volatile at the Giants. Frequency of tons over the last couple of years isn't high. Where does a guy like a Perryman end up getting into this top 50 countdown? Well, there's a couple of reasons for it. Number one is when you actually kind of laser into some of his seasons, over 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 week stretch, depending on the format, he's comfortably hitting this 85 to 100 sort of average range. And to pick a player at this spot in our sides, given the volume of trades we've got in Dream Team and SuperCoach, let alone the 2 trades a week of use it or lose it in AFL Fantasy, he doesn't have to be a 6, 8, 10 end to the mid-season buyers kind of guy for us. He could be that player that we just go, get a couple of price rises and I jump over and get to somebody else. Because Jordox, when you look not just in 23, 24, but you've done a bit of work into sort of that 21, 22 sort of era, there's some decent scoring if you look just that little bit deeper than what that top end average is, which by the way, in those 2 years is still mid 80s in AFL Fantasy and low 90s in SuperCoach. So still perfectly fine for us to consider, but there's something underneath the skin of it a little bit more that should be exciting for coaches.
Yeah, well, the 2 best years he had were 21 and 22, and looking at 22 in AFL, AF and DT, his average sat at about 86, but there was an injured game in that year. So, you know, we like to pick and choose with our stats and our averages, but legitimately, if you took that injured game out, he's averaging around 90 that year in Dream Team and AF. So I thought, well, I wonder if that's role or, you know, maybe how the Giants were going. But I looked at the CBA numbers and he was getting midfield time. He pretty much got none last year for the Giants. But in 21, 22, he was getting CBAs and he was a part of that rotation. And that coincided with his best scoring season. So I guess the role watch that we're going to have in the preseason with the Pies is there a spot for him in the guts, or do they see him off half back? Do they see him on a wing? Do they even see him as maybe doing a bit of a run with role? Because he's done that in the past for the Giants too. So I guess for me, if it's looking like he's going to be part of the regular Collingwood midfield rotation, we're really going to talk about him because the last time he was playing a midfield role, he scored pretty well.
I think that's ultimately critical for all of the players we're looking at through this, not only just this 50 most relevant, but also in this price range where we're going, okay, we really need more than just a 10 to 15 points per game of jump to deliver value based upon investment. We are needing a 20 points per game jump to get you there. And it is going to come from one of those 2 positions. I think the most likely pathway to fantasy scoring, whether or not he gets this role or not is different, is playing through that midfield with the arrival of Dan Houston. As good as Perryman is as a playmaker and a ball user, he is not at Dan Houston's level. So I think if there's a specific ball movement courier out of this Magpie D50, it is going to be him. And then if there's any more kind of run and carry, it's probably more an Isaac Quaynor. So I do think if he is to find a pathway to fantasy and SuperCoach relevance for us, it's got to be through this midfield. But this midfield and halfback spot, and even to the wings, as you've mentioned, is really interesting for me because the Pies are stacked with guys that can play a little bit of outside on the wing, can play as a centre bounce midfielder, and have also played as distributors and playmakers off half-back. I'm talking Crisp has done it over a better part of his career at the Magpies. Side bottom more recently has started to play a little back off the half-back flank as well as the wings, and then less through the inner circle of the CBA as he's aged. Perryman's now in there. Dacos, I think, is less likely to be anywhere other than centre-bouts, but he's been through there as well. We've talked about Houston and Pendlebury have all played through there. So this is where his versatility, the desire of position versus the needs of the Magpies. Like, you put these three ingredients into the mixing pot, and this, almost more than anything else, becomes a defining factor to his relevance in 2025.
It does. They've got a lot of guys that could play different roles, as you said. I think the one thing that's of interest to me is Tom Mitchell, who, as of recently, had a bit of a setback, and, fingers crossed for Titch. But I think there's a spot there. If they're not getting consistent, games out of Tom Mitchell, I think that's where it probably opens things up. And guys like, side bottom, Pendles, those guys, I don't see them really in the midfield. Pendles is like, remember Sean Burgoyne at the Hawks? He wasn't playing midfield for years at the end of his career, but when they needed a centre clearance, they chucked him in there. I could see Pendles playing that role. So, I think there's a spot for him, and it's just going to come down to, the preseason and where all the pieces land. I think Collingwood are going to want to have a pretty reliable sort of core group and not want to play around with it too much. I think last year was an opportunity to try different things. This year, clearly, with the trade period they had, they clearly see themselves as a chance to go straight back to the top. So, it's going to be interesting, MJ. I think Perryman, he's got a real opportunity here, and I can see it coming through for him.
Yeah, I think a Degoe Dacos and of the Nick variety is kind of their core two through that centre bounce, and then it's a factoring of protection of age, the longevity of careers, the availability of physical health, and you mentioned Tom Mitchell as an option. So there is a pathway in world where Perryman plays that Mitchell ball-winning, little bit of defensive support so that Dacos is fully there. Like, there's a pathway and narrative that we need to ultimately see through the preseason. But you're right. There is a world where he can start at the first centre bounce on opening round, and it's believable, and it's not just because he's trying to do something against his old Giants. I think the thing that ultimately you've got to layer on top of this entire conversation around his positional volatility and where he might sit in this Magpies unit is the fact that they're actually not a great fantasy-friendly team, the Magpies. The way they've chosen to move the ball under Craig McRae is very unfriendly for fantasy and super coaches. Last year, the club was ranked bottom 5 across all the formats for points for in Supercoach and AFL Fantasy. They were bottom 3 in the league for possessions, and they were ranked last for marks. So again, this ability to control the ball through possession, this opportunity to pick up scoring components. While he, as you mentioned, he does score through tackles as well as loose ball gets. He can win the hard stuff. There is some hard ways to score, and a team that you now know has an elite ball mover off halfback in Houston, and someone who I think could be the best player in the league by the end of the year if he's not already pretty darn close to it, in Nick Dacos, both taking such what I see as a heavy market share of points. Is there going to be enough going around? I think the upside that ultimately determines all these question marks is, politely, Jordox, we're a little bit saved with having to stress too much about him. With him playing in opening round against the Giants, we, at least in the fantasy community, we get to see what he could be, know what that scoring is, and ultimately how opening round goes almost determines whether or not he's a consideration or not. It's as simple as that, isn't it?
Yeah, and you'd think if he got even a hint of midfield time in opening round against the Giants, he's going to take it with both hands, because this is a club he's left, for many reasons, but I'm sure one of them is he potentially was frustrated that he wasn't getting a more regular and consistent role in the midfield. So he'll be keen to show it off. The other thing with Perryman that we probably haven't discussed yet is the injuries. And I don't know a great deal about what he's gone through, and I'm not prepared to say the guy is injury prone. But the reality is he hasn't played a full season in his career yet. He's gotten close, being a bit harsh. I think 2020 he played all but one. But across the career, he's been a guy that's missed chunks of footy. So, you know, we don't like to ever say don't pick players because they're injury prone. In fact, if you're going to pick a player like that, you're best off starting them than trading into them. But it is worth putting into the whole melting pot of the conversation of Harry Perryman. His price isn't exactly super bargain low. The role we're not clear on just yet, and he does have a history of injuries.
Yeah. Everything hangs off that opening round. If he delivers something sub 80, just knowing the double price movement of AFL Fantasy after round one, and then that pricing cycle cadence is that week ahead in SuperCoach than the rest of the league that don't play in opening round. If he goes sub 80, you just got no interest. So all of a sudden that injury risk that you mentioned, that role risk or uncertainty, you've just got no interest. But if he pops a 105 to a 110, well, now you've got an interesting decision to make. Do you go, well, he's got the Port and the Dogs the following 2 weeks, and then a challenging buy in round 3, meaning he's only got the one price movement in SuperCoach, but you do have a couple more in AFL Fantasy. The negative, he stops. The positive, you can put one of those rookies on field to get you to that best 18 scoring a little faster. Does he get you into a Lockie Whitfield if you want to look and see at what one of those top-end defenders look like? With Gold Coast having a round 2 bye, does it give you a chance to almost get some money out of him if he does pop early and then jump over to a Dan Rioli who wouldn't have moved his price point very much in AFL Fantasy and none at all really in SuperCoach with that round 2 bye? So everything hangs around opening round and all of the dominoes kind of fall because we haven't spoken about a lot of players yet this preseason. It's Darcy and Perryman. But one of the challenges that the coaches are facing through this defensive line is, man, I start looking through that top end of defenders and I don't have to dig too deeply to talk myself out of a defender at that top end. It's Whitfield. Well, how long is that body going to hold up? Sinclair. Well, that midfield unit has changed a little bit and they've got a great young kid in Travaglia. Well, all of a sudden, Sicily, we don't know with 2 interceptors coming into that back line. Even if he holds there, how does that land? Can Max Holmes, where does he play? And does Bailey Smith hurt that a little bit? Harry Sheasel dropped his scoring just a fraction when he went into the midfield and he's not in that plum role. So you don't have to dig away too hard, which is where a Perryman does become attractive if he pops early that opening round score because it just enables a little bit of a pressure valve release and a look and see at what the top end defenders do.
Yeah, there's plenty of great defenders, but they're all sitting right at the top. And like you said, it doesn't take long to talk yourself out of them just for the sake of saving money. And then you end up landing on a Perryman and think, oh. So I think he'll be fairly popular if he's looking okay in pre-season. The only thing I would say about the opening round and what's the word, putting too much into what happens in opening round is Collingwood won't have Dan Houston. And I think one of the interesting parts of Collingwood acquiring Perryman and where he fits in is where does Houston fit in alongside him. So wherever he plays in opening round may not be exactly how it looks because Houston comes in round 1 after his suspension ends. But I think he'll be pretty popular, MJ. I think whenever a player changes clubs, to a big club, they're on people's mind. So when you see it, certainly in early squads, when you're first jumping on, say, oh yeah, he changed clubs. Oh yeah, he might be better there. It just happens. So I think he'll be reasonably selected early days, but once we get to the sharp end of it, just before March, I think it's just going to depend on what the word out of Collingwood is in terms of role.
Yeah, well, those are the 2 factors, aren't they? How defined and clear is the role coming from the club during the preseason? And what does he score in opening round? And how did he get those scoring elements? Those 2 things combined really quickly move Houston into someone that you're like, nah, no interest, I'm going up, across, or down as a parachute option in my starting squad, or, all right, now I've got a decision to make, and what are the cascading implications of should you start with him? Those two variables determine whether or not he is fantasy and supercoach relevant for us to start the year in 2025. But what does it mean on draft day, given the fact that he's priced in that 70s range across the formats, Jordox? I just don't see a reason to really bustle out and overpay for him on draft day. I'm keen on your take. I think he's got the potential to be as definitely inside the top 30 defenders across the formats. I think that's definitely within his scope and spectrum. But I don't think you need to spend a D3 or higher selection point on him. Where do you see him going on draft day?
Yeah, I think he'll be. I could see him being a bargain. When we look back at the drafts, because of that lower average. The only thing is, if you did really have your heart set on him, I would caution waiting too long, just because of that change of clubs factor. It puts players on people's radar, even if the average wasn't great last year. Where would I grab him? Yeah, I'd be pretty happy with him at D3. I think that would be pretty good. So I can see his season making him a solid D2, but I think draft-wise it'd be D3, D4, and a good chance of getting him as a bargain.
Yeah, I think if you can get him at D4, that's right, that sweet spot for me to really land him. There's going to be some leagues where he drifts to his D5, but I think they're on the lower side of probability than not. But yeah, if he can hit that D3 with the potential and chance of a D2, well, yeah, my goodness, if you get anyone that can leapfrog a spot or two based on the value you play like that, then definitely you're absolutely firing. Hey, Jordox, been a great start to the 50 most relevant. We had Mini Monk on yesterday. We've had you on today talking about two, for some, maybe unique, or for others, broken a few hearts at sharing a few of their ones that were there. Thanks for being on this episode of the 50 most relevant, mate.
No worries, mate. Looking forward to the next one.
If you want to find out who's in at number 48 in the 50 most relevant, hang tight for 30 seconds. I got a clue for you to see if you can guess who this person is. But if you want to catch up on either yesterday's episodes or anything else that the coaches panel have done in the off season, make sure you go and check out our YouTube channel. There's been videos dropping there right throughout the off season and pre-season. We've done team reveals. We've done best 22s or best 23s. In the case of SuperCoach, there's a great chat with draft guru Dylan Alexander, talking about the most relevant rookies for the upcoming season. So if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel or never watched a video that we've done of the 50 most relevant, make sure you jump over, subscribe to the channel. Make sure you give this video, if you are watching it, a like, and let us know in the comments below whether or not you are going to start Harry Perryman or not. Every single one of these episodes are also available as an audio podcast. Make sure you subscribe to us wherever you get your audio podcast and give us a 5-star rating. And in the description of this episode are all the details you need about how you can get in touch with us across social media, and also where you can become a part of our Patreon supporter group, our breakout and premium tier Patreons. They're getting the audio podcasts a day ahead of everybody else. So they're already ahead of you in the 50 and already consumed way more fantasy footy content for you this preseason. If you want to get involved, all the details for that and our Patreons, yeah, they get some cool other stuff, heaps of stuff, everything you need to know in the description of this episode. All right, how's your guessing game on? You ready to go? Here we go. Number 48. If you've done your team right now in either the team pickers of SuperCoach and Dream Team or AFL Fantasy that's open to the public, there's a pretty high chance that if I was to look at your team, this guy would be in your team. He's important to your structure. But if I honestly asked you, tell me why you've picked him, tell me how he got there, you'd find fairly quickly that your experiences and thoughts around this player are pretty similar to most in the community. There is a low literacy in the fantasy football community about this guy. They know his name, they've probably picked him, but they don't know truly why or how. Who is this player at number 48 in the 50 most relevant? We'll find out tomorrow with our first special guest coming up for the 50 most relevant.